Hello and welcome to the second in our series of Grow Wildlife Q&A events. My name's Ellen, I'm the Communications Officer for Grow Wild and I'll be facilitating the event. This one is all about fungi and we've got a great team with us here today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce, I've introduced myself, Ellen, that's me on the left there. And my colleague Chloe, who is monitoring the Q&A. So you can feel free to put any questions that you might have about fungi in there throughout the session, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can at the end. But I think you'll find that lots of your questions are going to be answered by our expert throughout the event, which leads me on to introduce our expert. And that is Lee Davies. Oh, you know what? I forgot Alison, who is our lovely program manager at Grow Wild. She is actually monitoring the slides for us. So thank you and welcome to Alison as well. Sorry. So Lee Davies is our Fungarium curator at Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. And he is going to be answering your questions this evening. So Lee, I would just like to hand over to you to say a few words about yourself, if that's okay.
Yep. I'm Lee. I look after Kew's scientific collections of fungi. So I guess I'm kind of like a librarian of mushrooms. I look after the collections, I look after new stuff coming in, and I help out researchers and visitors access the collections for whatever studies and research they're doing on different species.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lee, and welcome, and thanks for coming along tonight. We're really happy to have you here, and we can't wait to hear some of your expertise on the wonderful world of fungi. So just to run us through the order of the questions we're going to be tackling tonight with Lee, we've kind of put these together. They're some of our most commonly asked fungi questions from our Grow Wild community. So we really hope that they're covering off some of the areas that you're most interested in. So first of all, Lee's going to talk a little bit about what mycelium is and what it actually does. Then we're going to move on to talking a little bit about what makes fungi so important for life on Earth and the wider role that they play. We're also going to look at the best places to look for fungi in urban areas. This is a question we often get asked. They can be quite tricky to spot if you're new to fungi spotting. So Lee's going to talk a little bit about where you might be able to find some fungi too. We're also going to be touching on what we should be looking out for when we're trying to find fungi, so kind of key features and habitats. How you can get started identifying fungi, so Lee's going to give you a few tips on that. And then we're also going to look at some more sort of gardening concerns around if fungi are taking over the trees in your garden and what we can do about that. So that brings us to our first question, which is what is mycelium and what does it do? So Lee, I'll hand back over to you for this one.
Okie dokie. So mycelium is the body of the fungus. The bit that everyone knows and is familiar with, the mushroom, that's just a very, very small proportion of the actual whole organism. And it's also a very specific part of the organism as well. So to put it in a different term, if you imagine a fungus was a tree, then the mycelium is the root, trunk, the leaves, the branches, the twigs, all of the part that does all the work. So the mycelium is doing the growing, it's looking for food, it's attacking other fungi, it's defending itself from other fungi or other organisms, and it's doing all the growing and exploring. The mushroom is just the reproductive part. So it's just like the flower or the apple, if you like, that's on the tree that you see. And the mycelium is the bit you don't see because it's underground or it's growing inside a rotting tree or inside a living tree, for instance. And so it's the bit that's invisible, but it's doing all the work.
Fantastic, and it's really fascinating because, as you say, when we're out and about, we might see fungi growing, and actually we only see maybe less than a tenth of something of what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's like less than 1%, I reckon.
Less than 1%. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the mycelium can be enormous. So, I mean, the biggest living organism on Earth is a fungus. It's a honey fungus. And the mycelium is underground and it covers an area of about 4 square miles. And it lives in North America, in Oregon, and it's called the humongous fungus.
Excellent name as well. It kind of does what it says on the tin there.
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lee. That's really fascinating. So we'll move on to our second question. which is what is it that makes fungi so important for life on Earth?
Okay, so there are two kind of, if you like, major lifestyles of fungi and the way that fungi live that make them so important. The first one is that they are massive recyclers. They are turning all of the organic matter in the soil, breaking it down and making all those nutrients available again. So they're the ones that are really turning over organic matter on Earth and taking leaves, branches, wood, and making all that available for other plants and animals to eat. And they're one of the only organisms that can actually break down wood and digest wood. If we didn't have fungi doing that, then wood would just build up and nothing else could break it down. The other major one is that there's these things called mycorrhizal fungi, and they are fungi that live in a symbiotic relationship with plants. About 95% of all plants need to have one of these symbiotic fungi living with it in order to survive and thrive. And what happens is the fungal mycelium and the roots of the plant underground kind of grow into one another. In some cases, it means that the fungus forms like a little sock or mitten around the root tips. In other cases, the fungus grows inside the tree root itself. And what happens here is that the fungus is taking nutrients from the soil, things like phosphorus and nitrogen, things that the tree can't really get very well itself, and it's feeding those to the tree. And in response to that, the tree is providing sugars from photosynthesis, which is feeding to the fungus, because the fungus can't normally get sugars like that. So they support each other, they feed each other, and without these sort of mycorrhizal fungi helping out plants, trees would not survive and thrive.
Wow, that's amazing. So actually, we think that a tree, you know, looking at it might just need water and earth, but actually it needs to have these kind of fungi friends that actually help to feed it and keep it thriving as well. Yeah,
I mean, the only reason it can, so and the fungi also help provide the water as well, because it gives them a bigger surface area. So, you know, the earth and the water, basically plants are stuffed if there were no any fungi.
Wow. So they're almost like extra kind of doing the work of extra roots, almost reaching out and finding that water sources and food sources for the tree.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you, Lee. All right, so we'll move on to our next question then. So this is more in relation to if we're out and about trying to spot fungi and we've got the bug for it and we're trying to sort of see where we can find fungi. Lots of our audience live in urban or semi-urban areas. Can you tell us a bit about some of the best places to look for fungi in urban settings, please?
Okie doke. There are a few things. So if you have a park near you, so I mean, really anywhere that's green or has plants in some way is the best place to look. So if there's any parks nearby, those are really good. In front gardens, for instance, especially around the edges on soil, or if there's trees growing. You'll even find them if you have like flower beds or those big containers, sort of, you know, on streets and outside buildings. If there's wood mulch in any of those, or in any way, you'll always find fungi living on wood mulch because they're breaking down the wood. Graveyards are a really good place because they're kind of green and left alone generally. So anywhere that's got greenery in any way, shape or form is a good way. Just look around the base of those sorts of things, whether it's plants or trees. You'll usually find something, especially in autumn.
Brilliant. So it's not necessarily a question of living somewhere that's really wild. As long as you've got the right conditions, you will come across fungi in urban settings too.
Yes, wow. I mean, anywhere there's soil, effectively, you'll be able to find fungi. And even if you have a street with trees planted, look around the base of trees, because you can quite often find things. Even if it's a small patch of soil or dirt, you might find small sort of wood rotting or fungi living in that soil, breaking down dead leaves and things like that are accumulating around the bottom of the trees.
Great. So super easy to get started then for people. Excellent. And autumn's the prime time.
Yes. And of course, I just thought I should mention because lichens. So even where there's rocks and stones and walls, all that, lichens are a really good one to look out for. You'll find them on buildings, growing on tree branches, on rocks. You know, lichens are a type of fungus. They're really pretty as well. So if you get a chance, keep an eye out for lichens as well, because they're even easier to find because they're out and about all the time.
Brilliant, good tip. Thank you for that. And so, what should people look out for when trying to find fungi out and about? We've touched a bit on kind of which places to look in urban settings, but are there any more sort of general habitats or conditions where to look in that people could be looking out for?
Okay, so I'd say that the main thing is look down. That's always keep your eyes down on the ground. That's where you're going to find fungi. I guess the key conditions you really need to find are, it needs to be cool and damp. So middle of summer is not going to be very good because it's going to be hot and dry, which is why kind of autumn through into winter, this time of year, is much better because the fungi need the moisture in the soil to be able to grow. And when you've got those conditions, anywhere that's effectively dampish is a good place to look. And I would say, yeah, anywhere you can go with this soil or plants and it's damp and cooler, you should have no difficulty finding something. And although most fungi look like what people think of as a mushroom, some of them could be really, really small, like, you know, maybe a centimetre or so tall. There are also quite a lot of fungi that will, they don't look like mushrooms. So there's on the picture on there, there's a thing called a bird's nest fungus. It forms like a little cup with the little eggs inside. Each of those is probably only about ½ centimetre across. So you really need to kind of look out for odd looking, unusual shaped things on the ground, because some of them will be fungi. There'll be ones that look like discs, like little bright coloured discs, little cup shaped things that are very, very small, but are really, really pretty, and are not what people normally think to look out for, because they're normally looking for mushroomy mushrooms.
Right, so it's having a keen eye for spotting those tiny ones that you wouldn't necessarily expect, and then sort of looking around sort of areas like woodlands with lots of rotting damp wood. Would those be good places to look?
That's I mean, woodland's the best place. Anywhere there's a dead fallen tree, whether it's rotting and moist, you'll find this, you know, come autumn, it'll be covered in all sorts of things. And once you start seeing the little fungi, that's when you'll get your eye and you'll start seeing more and more and more.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that leads quite nicely on to the next question, which is how can I get started identifying fungi? Have you got any hot tips? Okay,
so the bad news, I guess, is that actually identifying fungi down to, if you like, the species is really difficult. And even experts, I mean, I've only been doing fungi for like 6 years. There are experts who've been working here for like decades, and people I work with, there are things they don't know they can't identify them until they get them into a lab and start to look at things under a microscope. So there are a lot of fungi that are really difficult to do, which is fine. You don't have to be able to get everything to it, you know, perfectly identified straight away. But it is difficult for some things. For other fungi, it's not difficult. It can be some that will be very easy to identify. And there are some really good identification guidebooks out there. I don't think I'm allowed to promote this. There's a guy called Roger Phillips who writes ID books, and they're really good. Lots and lots of pictures. Plus, it also gives you things, information about them that can help to identify them if you don't have a microscope. So sometimes fungi can smell. If you were to break it open, it will smell, you know, unusual. Or they'll maybe, if you damage them, they'll change colour. So all of those sorts of features that you can use if you're finding fungi for the first times. Those sorts of things are in these books that are good as ID guides, and they're the best place to start. I'd also say there are a couple of, well, there's the organisation, the British Mycological Society. They're really good. They will hold events. They'll do talks and tours and guided walks around places. So if you have a look at their website, it can be quite good as a starting place to go. And every October there's a UK Fungus Day. Excuse me. UK Fungus Day. I've got a tickle in my throat now from talking. And the UK Fungus Day is really good. They have events all over the country with people helping. Excuse me.
No worries, take your time. That's really interesting, actually. I've got the Roger Phillips book myself. I when I joined Grow Wild, I got quite into sort of starting to spot some fungi, and I do find it quite helpful. And one thing I would just add to Lee's comments is that Grow Wild, we would never recommend that you eat any fungi that you find in the wild, just purely because, echoing what Lee said, it can be really difficult to identify fungi, and you sometimes need a microscope. Even sort of spore colour and shape, can that be a factor as well, Lee, in identification?
Yeah, I mean, the shape of the spores is usually what it comes down to quite a lot. So when there are certain genera, things like called Rustula, which get called brittle gills, and you'll find there's like 3 or 4 species all of the same shape, size, and colour, and you have to look at the ornamentation on the spores to identify which it is, which means you need like a microscope, you need the chemicals to stain spores so that you can see them under the microscope. In some cases, just like it's very difficult, and it can be the difference between something that's perfectly tasty and edible or something that isn't necessarily very tasty. It won't necessarily be super toxic, but it just might not be very pleasant.
Yeah, so really important there that we we just kind of focus on identifying and having a go with our books when we're first starting out, and let's leave it to the experts to identify the edible from the non-edible.
It gets really risky. There's even people who know what they're doing, who've been collecting and foraging for like years and years, can make mistakes. The worst ones are things, those the fungi that look like something that's perfectly edible, or can be the ones that are like horrible death, kidney, liver failure, painful death over 3 weeks. It can go really wrong with people who know exactly what they're doing. So it's just, don't risk it unless you're with an expert who knows what they're doing, because there are a couple of species which are edible, which are meant to be quite tasty, which are easy to identify, but always start with someone who knows what they're doing.
Yes, and just to add to that, this shouldn't put you off having a go at just spotting fungi when you're out and about. By all means, get a good reference book and have a go at kind of seeing which ones you think might be different species around you. Yeah, thank you for that, Lee. So we've got a final question, which is more related to gardening and what we can do when fungi start to sort of take over and grow on the trees and other plants in our gardens. If a certain fungus is taking over a tree in your garden, what should we do about that, Lee?
Okay, so the simple answer is there's not much you can do for various reasons. So the one that comes up a lot is honey fungus. So I think on the pictures it's the one on the far left, which is like clusters of brownish mushrooms that you'll find at the base of a tree. With honey fungus, if you have it, there's nothing you can do. You literally have to take a scorched earth policy. You have to dig up the tree, dig out the soil. It's awful. I mean, when we have it at Kew, they dig out whole beds and burn the soil and put fresh new soil in, because it's so horribly and pervasive and difficult to get rid of. So if it's a big tree, you might want to look at taking some of the branches down, but there's nothing you can do with that one. Other fungi you might come across are things like called bracket fungi, so polypore fungi. So these are the ones in the middle. So there's a chicken of the woods, and then there's a type of thing called a Ganoderma. If you have those growing on trees, again, there's nothing you can do, because that's just the outside part. That's just the reproductive structure. That mycelium is already inside the tree, growing and doing its thing. And by and large, the trees you'll have in your garden, it's not going to do an awful lot of harm. There's a certain element of symbiosis going on, because every tree or plant you have in your garden has fungi living inside it, even if you can't see them. And they're not causing disease or killing it. They're just sort of living in there, doing their thing. And when they're fruiting like this, it just shows that there's a particular fungus in there that's doing quite well, and it's not necessarily going to kill the tree. So I guess in most cases, unless it's something like honey fungus where you need to dig it all out, things like bracket fungi or fungus that's coming up in the soil or in the grass, for instance, leave them alone, because they're either helping out the garden by recycling nutrients that your plants are going to need, or they're living in the plant and the shrub or whatever, not causing any major harm, and they're just kind of getting on with it. And I think it'll make the garden look nicer.
Brilliant. So we shouldn't really be picking or getting rid of the fungus unless it's something that's actually quite destructive, such as the honey fungus.
And if you think if you pick all the fungus, you're not doing any damage to the fungus itself. That's just like picking all the apples on a fruit tree or picking all the flowers off a bush. The bush is still there or the tree is still there. All you're doing is getting rid of the fruiting bodies, the reproductive part, and it'll just produce them again next year. And by and large, anything you see that's growing in lawns or flower beds is more than likely helping out the garden, either by recycling nutrients or by directly supporting your plants by feeding them, and they're mycorrhizal, so they're feeding them back. So it's just leave them alone. They're lovely. There's not much point.
Fungi are our friends in this situation.
Yes, almost always fungi are your friend.
Brilliant. Well, that's great to know. Well, hopefully that's answered most of your kind of fungi related questions, but we're now going to take a few questions from the Q&A that you've been submitting throughout the talk. So thanks for sending those in. I'm going to hand over to Chloe, and she's going to pick a couple of our top questions, and hopefully Lee will be able to answer those. So over to you, Chloe.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Yeah, so thanks everyone who's been posting questions. I'm going to just pick a few. Phoebe asked, what's the best way to try and observe mycelium? Obviously, we see the fungi, the actual mushrooms coming up, but if you wanted to see the mycelium, is there a way to do that?
You can do. So, if you want to do it at home, what you do is you let bread go moldy. So the mold that you get growing on bread, that is mycelium. You could look at that if you like. Alternatively, if you have a compost heap, or you can get out somewhere like a park where there's leaf litter or mulch around trees, if you kind of dig some of that out a little bit, dig underneath the top layer of the mulch or the leaf litter or in a compost heap, you might start to find the mycelium, and it will be like this white, fibrous, cottony mass holding everything together. Usually it's white. You might get some paler browns and yellows, and that's the mycelium. It's not exciting to look at, sorry. I think actually the only exciting fungal mycelium is honey fungus. Honey fungus produces some really cool mycelium. They produce these really thick black threads, which they look like strawberry bootlace sweets, but black, and they're really tough. They're really cool. But most fungal mycelium is it's just this sort of white, fibrous, cottony mass you might find if you dig through mulch or leaf litter.
Great. Thank you very much. That's great. Helena says she's surprised how few fungi that she's seen this autumn, and she wondered if it had been a bad year for fungi. I don't know, Lee. Do we get bad years for fungi? Does maybe the weather in different times of the year affect how many fungi species we see in the autumn, or no impact?
It does impact. It's hard to say myself because I've been furloughed with COVID. I'm not getting to go out and see much. So I know that last year was a really good year. There were just lots and lots of fungi coming up last autumn. Not only were they in large numbers, but there were some of the mushrooms that were coming up. Things like parasol fungi were humongous. There were ones like this across. They were colossal ones. So I think there will be definitely good years, and I think probably like this year probably might have been a bad year, particularly where you are. I would say if anything, it's because we had quite a long hot summer, and I think autumn was quite late starting, so it stayed quite warm and dry quite late. So I would say it where you are might have been quite bad, and I can't compare with myself because I've not been here in the gardens very much to go out and look. So I probably haven't seen as much as I saw last year. So I think it might have been not the best of years. Yeah, it's a difficult way to explain because I have not much reference because I wasn't out and about.
Yeah. But obviously, it seems like the weather can play a big part in, whether it's a good year or not. So yeah, it's good to know. Thank you, Lee. Kind of coming sort of aligned with that, really. Patricia was asking if there was a way she could encourage fungi to grow in her veg patch to sort of improve the soil. Is there anything that you can do in your own space to kind of encourage fungi to grow?
Usually, I would say if you have a veg patch and you put manure on it or you put mulch on it, that's all you need to do. The the one thing that fungi really don't like is nitrogen-based fertilizers. If you're putting fertilizers on the soil, the fungi won't like it. Usually, all you need to do is like kind of leave them be. If you have a veg patch and you're putting cow manure or horse manure or something on, that's all you need to do. And if you leave some of the manure on the surface, come autumn, you might start to see some fungi coming up in that. But generally speaking, low nitrogen, don't put any extra nitrogen on, no fungicides, obviously. But the fungi will they'll be happy and they'll do their thing in that. The shame is that quite often you won't see them because the mycelium is quite small and it's not a chunky thing. So generally speaking, leave them alone, give them good organic food, and they will churn it all up and they'll break it down and make it all available for the veg.
Great, pretty low maintenance then.
Very, that's the thing. That's the good thing.
Great. Okay. I think we've got time for maybe one more. Quite a few people were asking about resources for identifying fungi, and I think you covered that topic really well. But Diana was asking whether there was an app that was available for helping with identify fungi. I don't know whether you know if there's an app that would be useful.
There was one, I think, was it this year or last year? I think someone produced an app. I don't know what it's called, but I think it did exist. I don't know if it's still around. I think possibly one of the criticisms of things like that is that using purely a visual guide, like a photograph, to identify the fungus to be certain is really difficult. I think, as I mentioned, because quite often you have to start to look at microscopic features, or you have to look at features, things like on the gills and the way that the gills attach to the stem of the mushroom. And I think because it can be a lot more complex than plant or what have you, I think it's a lot tougher. But I'm fairly sure there was one out last year. It must have been last year because it wasn't over lockdown, and that's been almost all of this year. But I'm almost certain there was one that came out. But I don't know if it's still going because it's a tough one to do purely from photographs.
Yeah, so you've got to, it's all that detail, isn't it, really? You probably can't capture it just with an app, and it might lead you down the wrong path, which could be quite dangerous, I guess, with fungi. So, okay, good to know. All right. I think, are we out of time now, Ellen, or have we got time for one more?
No, I'd just like to say we're probably out of time for today, but I'd just like to say a big thank you to Lee for joining us today. Hopefully he's been able to answer your most burning questions about fungi and to cover off most of the topics. Just to say that the session is recorded, so we'll be editing it and uploading it to our YouTube channel and sending it around via our newsletter shortly afterwards. So you'll be able to access all this information again. So if you didn't get a chance to take notes, or if you missed something, there'll be a chance to rewatch again. Another thing to say is that we're hoping to run more of these sessions in the new year. So we're going to be putting together a programme for 2021. So just make sure that you're following us on Facebook at Grow Wild UK, as well as Instagram, which is the same tag at Grow Wild UK. And also you could sign up to our newsletter via the website, which is growwilduk.com. And that means that you'll get sent all the updates about future events that are coming up. So we really hope that you enjoyed hearing from Lee today. Thank you both to Chloe and Alison for doing a great job behind the scenes there. And we hope you enjoyed it. Have a lovely festive period and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Thanks.